Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Advocate podcast. As a celebration of my 50 years with being with horses, I thought I would read my autobiography called Since the Days of the Romans, My Journey of Discovering a Life with Horses. This will be chapter 2 and chapter 3, and I hope you enjoy. If you're following along and reading this because you're on the video or if you have the book, I've decided that I will change the names because I use fictitious names. I'm going to be using their real names in the reading of this book because I think that's just the honest thing to do. And I hope everybody doesn't mind. All right, here we go. Chapter 2, I Need Work. June in New York had always been the best time in my life. The cold, wet rains of spring were replaced with what we in the Tucker family called top-down weather. Dad would drive his family for sunset drives in the Metropolitan, a very small yellow and white car with a black canvas convertible roof that we called the putt-putt. Mom would occupy the co-pilot seat wearing a babushka that flapped stiffly in the breeze. Judy and I would stuff ourselves in the back seat, where the square foot area was the size of a shoebox. We never knew if a trip would cause fighting matches between us or we would laugh uncontrollably. We would often stop at Carvel for a soft serve ice cream cone. It was a wonderful time. June also marked the end of school as everyone broke from the rigors of learning to a life of fun in the sun. During the later years in high school, I worked either as a golf caddy or on the town crew cleaning storm drains and operating a jackhammer. These jobs had early quitting times, and there was still plenty of time to go to the beach or scuba dive. I had enough money, and life was good. This year, however, was a different June. I was no longer in school. This was not the start of summer vacation. Rather, it was the start of my life as a man and a horseman. I needed to find a place to work and live. The rose-colored glasses I always wore in June were set aside as I squinted against the afternoon sun. I had left Ohio 2 weeks before and was feeling better about my life, having a clear direction now. I left my parents' house late in the morning and drove to an area where I knew there would be horse farms, but I had no plan. I was scared, but I always had a bed and a meal with my dad and mom. I drove to Mount Kisco and then out to the hills of Bedford. It was close to afternoon feeding time at a thoroughbred breeding and training farm off of West Patton Road when I pulled into the long barn driveway. It was the first farm I looked at for work. The long white barn with green roof and trim was symmetrical. A back-to-back feed room and a tack room followed 5 back-to-back stalls for a total of 10 stalls and 2 rooms. This made up one half of the barn. After a break through the middle of the barn, there were another 6 back-to-back stalls. The total of 22 12 by 12 foot stalls were encircled with a rideable shed row, and everything was contained within the barn walls. This was the training barn where the young horses were saddled within the stall, mounted, then ridden out into the shed row and trained. Behind the barn was a half-mile training track to gallop and condition the horses. Between the barn and track was a circular pen made of chain-link fence. Within this pen, horses were lunged, or if they had an injury, were turned out for fresh air, but had limited space to ensure they would not re-injure themselves. Earlier that day, the pen had another use. An employee, high on drugs, had taken a horse into the pen and started to beat it. Walt, the trainer, caught him and fired him on the spot. When I drove up, Walt and the owner, Mrs. Waller, were standing by the pen discussing how to handle the duties being one man short. As I approached, their looks of concern turned from their matter of being shorthanded to me. I introduced myself and said that I was looking for work. Walter was a former jockey and exercise rider. His short stature had weathered hands that were constantly bringing cigarettes to his ever-trembling lips. When he talked, his words would be mumbles. His body lurches sideways as he walked. He was a strange man with physical injuries only he and his wife knew about, but he knew horses, thoroughbred horses specifically, better than he knew anything else. Mrs. Waller was a dominating and imposing woman. Hips that moved with authority supported her towering 6-foot stature. Her facial expressions could be kind with understanding eyes and a melting smile. Then, in a blink of an eye, would turn into a sharp-tongued lashing of a person's soul, cutting to the depths of her opponent until she emerged the victor. Her thick glasses frequently traversed down her nose, exaggerating the size of her eyes, to quickly being clutched in one hand and shook at the person she was talking to emphasize her point. Her agitated state could always be determined by the degree she fiddled with her ever-present glasses. She was a strong ally as anyone could have, but also a woman who would say without hesitation what was on her mind. Mrs. Waller, of course, took command of my impromptu shed row interview. Walt took a step backwards. "Have you any experience with horses?" she asked. I lied. I know how to put a tail set on, remembering watching Candy do the same. That, at a thoroughbred breeding and training farm, was useless, as I later discovered. Her question, though, had another purpose. She was digging to see if I had character that was better than the last drughead that had just beaten one of her prized horses. I told her I was from Chappaqua, and my dad was a New York City lawyer, hoping she would realize I was from a good, hardworking, and honest family. I was hired on the spot to start the next day. I was earning $80 a week, working 5½ days a week. The job also came with my own 2-bed, 1-bath apartment. Walt didn't say anything, but I was overjoyed. Bill, the farm manager, met me at 7 a.m. on my first day at Tanracken Farm. Bill is a little hard to describe, but eccentric probably suits him well. His mind was always somewhere, but not always with the person he was talking to at the time. His eyes twinkled and his lean body moved with little grace, jerking with hesitation as his thoughts took him one way, then another. In mid-sentence, sometimes he would end his conversation with you and suddenly just turn and leave. Bill drove a 20-year-old Willis Jeep pockmarked with rust, and he often ground the gears that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard to almost everyone on the farm. Bill had a tendency to answer questions rather cryptically, which was sometimes a challenge for me. "Can the horses be turned out tonight?" I would ask. His answer simply would be, "The Yankees are playing tonight." Many a time, an answer like that would stop me dead in my tracks as he walked out of sight without another word. I'm sure he never thought twice about it, but sometimes having to guess what the heck he was thinking would keep me up at night. For the first time, I really felt like I was doing what I was supposed to do in life. I had a job, and not just any job, but one where I spent all my time around horses and learned more with every new day. Bill led the way. "You'll be working here at the training barn," he said. "Chris and Robert will make sure you know what to do here. I'll be back at 10 or so to show you your apartment." We walked inside and found Chris, a red-headed woman who looked like she was all business and acted like she was the boss. I saw through her tough skin right away into her kind heart. She was my introduction to a type of female that I describe as a barn girl, my highest form of compliment to a woman. A rough exterior with hardened hands, but a warm heart and a willingness to work well beyond the limits of a normal person. Chris was always riding horses or cleaning tack. She often pitched in to clean stalls if there was nothing else to do. She never complained and took 1/4 tab of Butte, a potent horse painkiller, for menstrual cramps or cracked ribs, and kept smiling. Robert was a black man who had been with Mrs. Waller for a very long time. He lived with his wife and 2 sons, Sam and Mike, on the farm. He was a workhorse and could effortlessly manipulate a pitchfork full of manure like a gambler could flip cards, and he loved to laugh. He knew his job and his worth and was understandably a little miffed that an educated white boy was in his barn. As if he were saying, "Here, educated upper class white boy, let's see if you know how to use a pitchfork." He showed me the tools and pointed me in the direction of my first stall. I am fully aware that all animals, including humans, look the same with the skin removed. But this was 1973, and only a decade after race riots in America. I soon realized the difference between whites and blacks was deeper than skin color, and there were many layers of prejudices and incorrect assumptions to get through that flowed both ways. I discovered prejudice was all in our minds, and I soon went to work on creating a good relationship between Robert and myself. Why? Because we can learn and grow from everyone we meet. And at this point, Robert knew a lot more than me about working with horses, and I was humbled by that. In a short time, Robert and I became friends enough for him to invite me over for Sunday dinners where I tasted collard greens for the first time and the last time. He loved to barbecue, and I enjoyed the time I spent with his family. I became friends with his sons, Sam and Mike, as we played softball with other farm kids in a paddock where cow flops served as the bases. The next 2 years became the best 2 years of my life up to that point. I became addicted to work, mowing pastures on my day off just because I enjoyed being outdoors with nature and horses. I would rise at 3 in the morning and walk 1.5 miles to arrive at work by 4. Chores were done by 10 a.m., and I was off until 2 p.m. when afternoon chores started, and then finished by 4 in the afternoon. Often, I would stay during the midday break and repair fence or clean the hayloft. I never thought about what I was paid versus the work I performed. I never thought about vacation. I was always on time for work, and I can't remember taking a sick day. That is the difference between doing something for a paycheck and doing something you love. It never feels like work. The physical size of Tanrakin Farm was larger than I thought that first day, and it took several months before I understood the lay of the land. There were 2 divisions, Mrs. Waller's Farms and Mr. Waller's Farms. I worked for Mrs. Waller, who had the training barn, the pony barn, Newell's barn, the old folks' home, and the other barn. Mr. Waller had his barn where the stallion stood and the horses in training at Belmont Racetrack. There were about 100 horses total on the farm, and that number ballooned to 300 with visiting broodmares during peak breeding season. On average, over the years, 7 stallions stood with 5 thoroughbred stallions at Mr. Waller's barn and 2 at the pony barn, including a world champion pony stallion. Breeding and foaling season was over when I arrived in June that first year, and the farm was full of nursing foals. My job in the beginning was simple. I cleaned the 11 stalls on the west side of the training barn, stripping out all manure and urine using a metal 5-tine pitchfork and rake. I then added lime to the urine-soaked clay floors and shook apart wheat straw using the fork until the stall was covered in a bright yellow fluff. Then I added 3 flakes of hay, cleaned and filled the water buckets, raked the dirt shed row, and swept clean the wood planks laid between the dirt shed row and the stalls. In the summer, the horses stayed in the stalls during the heat of the day and were turned out overnight when it was cooler. In the morning, Robert and I would muck the stalls into the shed row. He was on the one side of the barn, and I was on the other, and we paced ourselves, but he was always faster. The mares with foals trashed the bedding and soaked everything with a lung-scorching ammonia urine smell. Each day, every mound of manure and wet spot was heaped into a pile just outside the door. Then the exposed clay dirt floor was raked clean, and a layer of hydrated lime was spread over the remaining urine to absorb the odor. Over time, this layer became crusted, and the pitchfork tines would stab and catch the thick cardboard crust. It would peel back into a thin 2-square-foot piece weighing 20 pounds or more. I would vainly attempt to balance it on the end of the pitchfork as I lifted the one-piece trophy, carefully rotated on my heels, then lifted higher to place it on top of the 5-foot pile of straw and manure outside the door. It was these small games I played that helped me through the morning. It was boring and hard work, especially during inclement weather. Yet I was learning very small lessons that proved essential to my growth as a veterinarian. The next part of morning chores involved the starting of the ancient red Dodge medium-duty truck with dump body attached to its frame. With a door that barely closed and windows streaked with barn dirt, cracked mirrors, hard, unpowered steering, and an engine that somehow turned over every time there was enough energy left in the battery, I carefully backed into the open door at the end of the shed row. This truck often went into the service garage for repair. One day, after the vet came to the farm and performed a castration, I took the discarded testicles and placed them into a bag. I drove the truck downtown and directly into the service bay. The Rhodesian Ridgeback dog performed guard duty and was always covered with patches of grease from lying in the junk piles. He eyed me carefully as I exited the cab and looked in the office for George, the owner of the shop. George was somewhere between ornery and just plain mean, where I was concerned. He obviously saw me as a nobody from the farm, which I was at the stage of in my career. On this day, George looked up from his desk, identified me, and gruffly said, "What now?" I calmed myself and then said, "The truck's got no balls. You need to find out what's going wrong and get its power back." I turned and left him, with his quizzical look transforming into one of frustration as I walked back to get my things. I removed the testicles, looked to make sure the dog was chained up, then threw them under the truck and left. My trick didn't help the truck, but obviously liking the joke, George became a little friendlier to me after that. After backing the truck up the shed row of the training barn, I would tumble out of the cab and walk back to the manure pile outside the first 2 stalls. Then, forkload by forkload, I would pitch the manure into the truck. Sometimes, when horses were left in due to bad weather and the loads were twice the normal size, Robert and I would double team and together lift larger than normal urine-soaked piles into the truck. Using a time-tested strategy of pile placement within the dump bed, we could get an amazing amount of waste in a load. To really fill it, I would leap onto the tailgate and climb on top of the pile, brace my hands against the ceiling rafters, and perform a stylish poop shoveler's dance. This packed the load even further, allowing us to add more before declaring the load full. Robert's dance always had more soul than mine, and shoes didn't last long on this job. Though we never fell off or broke our legs, there were times when we almost did. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, did not exist, and if it had, we probably would not have complied with any safety regulations in order to get the job done as quickly and efficiently as possible. The truck had farm tags that allowed us to travel anywhere in town on farm business without insurance or inspection. Hence, little was spent on maintenance. On a daily basis, we slowly drove the truck out the long drive and traveled 1/4 mile down the road and turned into a dirt path that led to the manure pile that was out of sight from the road. Turning in the small wooded area and avoiding trees, stumps, and wet sinkholes, we backed into position and lifted the dump body high to watch the load of manure slide out the back. Sometimes a well-packed load would catch and not slide off. To correct this, I would get out of the truck and with a pitchfork pull off half the load by hand. This difficult task was always made worse by either a downpour or a 20-degree blizzard, which seemed to happen with some regularity. With the load off, I popped the clutch and tore out of the manure pile. As the dump body gently lowered itself, the truck would hit every dip or rock, violently swaying the truck sideways, effectively throwing off any remaining bits of hay and straw. Then, as fast as the truck would allow me, I would drive it hard back to the barn, shifting the gears without the clutch, and repeat the process one or two more times that morning. The last load was always mentally easier than the first. While I was at the dump, Robert would rake up the shed row, leaving a beautiful herringbone pattern in the dirt. Water buckets were then cleaned and filled. When all was done, we went to get the horses from the paddocks. This was part of the day I really loved. While I did not know it then, I attribute this time of learning and observing the horse as the greatest part of my veterinary education. Chris, Robert, and I would walk about 100 yards up a hill to catch the mares and foals. There were 10 pairs, and sorting them became an art form. Realizing who went first and how to avoid being kicked was essential to continuing work without injury. Bringing a mare and foal out through the gate without letting the rest of the fly-fearing, hungry, feral mares out to run freely about the farm taught me that calmness and leadership was essential. I was new to it, but with Chris and Robert's help, while not always successful, I did okay, and I learned quickly. The horsemanship skills I use today in my veterinary practice can trace their roots to these beginnings, where I was not only challenged with hundreds of different horses, but I was blessed with great teachers who cared that I got it right. Now, it may not seem like much, but 100 yards is a long way to lead a horse. In the relatively short amount of time spent turning out or bringing in horses from the far field, I began to form the horsemanship skills necessary to follow a lifetime of work with them. Today's vets magically go through high school, college, and then vet school. There is talk of shortening this path as veterinarians are becoming glorified technicians. Whenever old-timers get together to discuss horse and veterinary care, the subject of how veterinarians today are not horsemen always comes up. If it was up to me, I would require all candidates for vet school to leave the academic world and spend 2 years cleaning stalls and walking horses 100 yards every day. It is this practical, hands-on experience of being with and observing horses that gives you a larger understanding of their problems and essential care. It taught me valuable lessons I still use today. One lesson I learned was just observing the movement of the horse and how much it can tell you about their health. I clearly remember watching the hind legs of horses ahead of me as their hocks rotated outward with each step. Later in vet school, I would remember this as it helped me to understand that the hock is as much a rotational joint as it is an open and closing joint. It became essential to my understanding of hock disease, such as bone spavin. 2 years of almost daily walking and watching 22 horses, with or without foals, up and down a hill became an integral part of my understanding of leg movement, balance, symmetry, and pathology. Within a short time, I could pick out a subtle asymmetry of the very early stages of a lame horse at a walk. I was always told from my first day at Tanracken Farm to turn the horse around and have it face you before turning it loose, either into a field or back into its stall. This was and is the proper way to do things to avoid the horse kicking you as it goes by. I was also taught that when leading two horses together, take each lead rope and pass them through one hand so that the one end of one rope exits from your hand in one direction and the end of the other rope exits in the other direction. This way, if the two horses decide to take off on you, all you need to do is squeeze the ropes together with either your one hand or with both hands. The horses will then only be pulling against themselves and not dismembering your hands and arms. Leadership among horses is learned and encouraged. With foals, the first mistake people make is to allow the foal to follow the mare without a lead. What this teaches the foal is to be a follower. In addition, he is not taught that mutual respect is necessary in a human world. Horses are herd animals, and allowing nature to take its course, most become followers with only a few leaders. These following foals can become dangerous as well as unproductive in their lives. To avoid this, we always haltered our foals and led them in front of the mare. By simply doing this, we developed young horses that respected us and became more cooperative when being taught more advanced lessons, such as accepting a saddle. My first 2 years at Tanracken Farm were formative in more ways than I can consciously realize. Story time. A sad day on the new farm. The young family had just bought their farm in the spring a month ago. 5 acres of woods surrounded by more forests. The house was brand new, and moving boxes still littered their driveway and garage. I drove up the drive, forking to the right onto a dirt path leading around the house. I saw their 2 horses standing in a clearing in the woods. The couple and their daughter came out of the back door to greet me. "Thanks for coming out, Doc," the woman said as she led the way to the paddock. "Our sorrel gelding has stopped eating and is acting depressed." She was right. He didn't look like he had colic, but stood quietly with his head lowered below his top line, looking at the ground. He wasn't relaxed, nor was he fretting, and he showed no interest in food. Depressed seemed to be the best description. She slipped the halter and lead on him as I looked around at the surroundings. The trees were mostly deciduous: maple, cherry, and oak. A few pine trees scattered themselves about. One electrified wire made up the fence, and it was strung through the woods, claiming about an acre. Tree stumps remained from the clearing process, and limbs and branches were placed into several tall piles. The trunks were cut and stacked for firewood. There was no grass or any evidence of hay, nor was there a barn or even a run-in shed. I asked, "Tell me about this pasture," as I started my exam of the horse. "We just moved in a few weeks ago," the man said proudly. "The first thing we did was string a wire through the woods to make a place to turn out the horses. Plenty of shade and storm protection." I moved my stethoscope around the abdomen, lungs, and heart. Nothing, including the temperature, was abnormal. My mind started to struggle with what could be causing this horse to be so off with no clear physical signs. The man continued to describe the making of the paddock. "We let the horses settle in, and last weekend I started to cut the trees down to make a clearing," proudly showing his efficient thinking. "We planned to pull the stumps and then plant some grass seed." He had moved his family into a new house, his primary goal, and had proceeded to make the wife and daughter happy by moving the horses soon thereafter, even though he really had no good area prepared for them. I lifted the upper lip of the horse and blinked at the surprise I found. The normally pink mucous membranes were muddy brown. My heart sank as I started to prepare my approach in telling them that not only was the horse going to die, but also it was their fault. The resulting effect on the family would last a long time, and like every vet, I dreaded being the one delivering the news. "Your horse's kidneys are failing," I started. "They are being plugged with debris, much like a kitchen strainer gets clogged and the water can't pass through." There was silence. "What can you do?" they asked. At this time, a vet at Cornell, who I knew, had just published the toxic effects of red maple leaves. There was no known treatment, and I told them this. "Red maple leaves? What do you mean?" they asked. I continued to explain that when fresh green maple leaves start to die after a branch is removed from a tree, as in a storm causing a branch to fall, or after being cut down, the wilted leaf becomes toxic to the horse. It causes the red blood cells to burst. Their contents clog the kidneys, which leads to acute renal failure. The muddy brown gums are the telltale sign, and the rapid damage causes the horse to die quickly. The father understood. By cutting the trees down and keeping the branches in the paddock, he had killed the horse. Making it worse was substituting the tree leaves for forage in the effort to save money in giving hay. The sad day ended for me with euthanizing the horse, followed by a long drive home. I never saw that family again, and I suppose they sold the other horse, which had not been affected yet, ending their short life with horses. Chapter 3. Death Comes Swiftly. Anyone starting a career in anything knows the first year or two consists of a steep learning curve, and working with horses is certainly no different. Lessons are learned by observing other people doing things and following what they do. As you have probably already learned about me, I do nothing easily. Rather than learn from mistakes of others, I often learn from my own, and sometimes those lessons were life-threatening. In 1973, we always had a halter and lead rope on to do everything with a horse. We also always wore a helmet when riding. We always played by the rules and, with little exception, had no injuries. Those in charge, who knew so much about horses, also knew that while they are beautiful creatures, they could also be very, very dangerous. When you think about it, a horse weighs 5 to 10 times more than a human. You wouldn't let me run into you full speed, as it would definitely cause some injury. Now imagine one of these horses running into you. Odds are you wouldn't live through it. Horse owners, trainers, and vets often work around horses' legs and frequently run the risk of getting kicked. To understand the danger, think about me swinging a baseball bat at your head with all my strength. Scary, isn't it? A horse's leg is much heavier and more muscular than a bat and can swing at the same speed, fracturing bones, causing organ rupture, internal bleeding, and death. I have known people who have succumbed to all of these. There are rules that are important to abide by to lower this risk, so you can work around horses every day without fearing for your life. And I learned many of these early on. However, today's horse owners break these rules constantly and are injured and killed daily, and I understand how it can happen. In my first year alone, I almost became a statistic 3 times. It's a wonder I survived it all. Even though I'd been taught better, I never said I was smart. It's easy to look back at times you did something and barely cheated death. Invariably, you come away humbled and feeling very stupid. After all, you knew better, right? Has it ever happened to you? Well, it happened to me. Sassy Star was a pregnant chestnut mare living in the first stall beyond the break of the barn. She had little affection for humans, as her life had become a baby factory. Most people, who are what I call city folk, fail to understand that all animals have memories, opinions, and feelings. They aren't just objects. They have personalities and emotions, and that will catch up with you if you're not careful. Another thing city folks don't realize is that animals, bigger and stronger than a human, can kill you without blinking an eye. It is easy to understand the danger of grizzly bears and sharks, but not a sweet and affectionate horse. They would never intend to harm, right? Wrong. This was the day that I realized that I, too, was a city folk. She was my 6th stall of the morning, and the barn was quiet. As anyone who works with horses constantly will agree, you can never let your guard down, but we all do. The horse that will kill you is probably your own, or one you work with every day. This is because even though we know to constantly be aware, we get complacent, bored, or just lazy, and we forget. We forget that a horse is the size and weight of a small automobile and can mow you down in an instant. We forget those 4 legs we see and work around every day can crush your skull. I was in her stall cleaning it, and I broke the rules. And it wasn't just one rule I broke. It was 3, specifically. No halter and lead rope, the horse between me and the exit, trusting a horse I was familiar with. I was complacent and not connected with the horse. Add a touch of irrational fear in the horse, and the disaster was ready to unfold. Horses frequently get spooked and panic. It could be from a loud noise outside, a small bird fluttering through the barn, or it could be something they totally imagine. Either way, they panic and are gripped with irrational fear, and you never know when it might happen. I was in the diagonally opposite corner of the stall to the gate and was digging out some manure in the corner. I had closed the gate so I could go to that corner without the horse running out. I was not listening to nor paying attention to the feral broodmare, and she decided to communicate her displeasure with me. Dust and straw arose as she started to scramble. I wheeled myself around and placed my back into the corner of the stall. The mare had her head in the far corner by the stall door, and her long back with enlarged abdomen was sunk lower than normal toward the ground, and her hind end was facing me. I watched as if the whole scene was in slow motion. Her hips lowered some more, and the muscles of her hindquarters tightened. Her hocks and stifles were flexed, and her weight now shifted to the front limbs as she rose slightly on the tips of her hind hooves. The first kick was imminent. I was frozen in place. My mind went blank as I searched for options. The stall walls were smooth and 10 feet tall. I could leap up, grabbing the top edge, and swing my body up over into the next stall. I doubted my athleticism and worried that the surprised horse in the next stall would do. I quickly ruled out an escape over the wall. What was left then? I heard that time can slow when you are about to die. The purpose of this I learned that morning when I decided to do something I would have normally thought impossible with the amount of time left before the hind hooves punctured my body. It was something leaders do when faced with impossible odds. I cleared my mind and became calm. I had also heard that your life would flash before your eyes before you die. I can tell you that this is true as well. Within 1 second of real time, I had replayed everything significant that had happened in my life in sharp detail. I have not heard why this happens, but I can assume that everything in life has a purpose. I believe that if you have lived a good life, the remembrance can give you inspiration to take action so you can continue your life rather than paralyze yourself with fear and inaction. If, however, your life has been bad, then you will not take action and you will allow events to unfold that will kill you. I decided that I had more to live for, but if I was going to die, I was not going down without a fight. I firmly grasped my pitchfork, forced a loud, harsh-toned, growling scream as if I was an angry bear attacking, and swung the wooden fork handle across her buttocks. The mare instantly swung her head to the right and did a quick two-step to avoid the wrath of this crazed human. I saw an opening to her left, and in one giant step, lurched towards the stall door, past her still cocked haunches, and bounded onto the dirt floor, falling face first to the ground. The mare sank into the back corner of the stall as I gasped for breath and felt my heart pounding through my chest. Our eyes met, and we both knew the outcome was a surprise to us both. Though I'd barely escaped with my life, I learned two very important lessons that day. The first was that I was not scared of horses. The second was that I was committed to giving my life to them. Fear can keep you from being effective when dealing with animals large enough to kill you. You have to come to terms with this fear and get past it. I also learned to never let my guard down and constantly stay connected, especially around horses I know well, as they can and will kill you. My 2 years at Tanracken Farm was my testing ground, and my future plan to be with horses seemed to be unfolding flawlessly. I had learned so much about them, and I had developed a solid work ethic as well. Physically, I was in great shape, looking lean and well-muscled as I had unloaded trucks and wagons of hay and straw, unloaded railroad boxcars of oats, and ate little, living the bachelor life. With my focus on horses, I was not spending too much time underwater now, and my scuba equipment stayed stored at my parents' house and was eventually sold. Occasionally, I would go out on their boat, but being underwater had been replaced with a piece of watching horses graze in a field. However, another passion started to compete with the horses, and that was photography. I set up my bathroom as a darkroom. I covered the windows in light blocking aluminum foil, and I created light-proof seals for the door. I thought photography could become my higher income profession, and I wanted to give it a try, even though horses had my heart. I applied to Brooks Institute of Photography in Santa Barbara, California, and was placed on their waiting list for acceptance almost a year later. Again, it looked as though schools were just a business looking for money, and they really did not care if I was academically acceptable. I had dinner with my parents and broke the news to them. I laid out their financial commitments and sat back proudly with my thoroughness. My poor parents, once again. Their point of view was simple. While not being negative and fully understanding that I needed a higher paying skill, they reflected on my track record and drew me into their compassionate conclusion. Okay, they said, this is the last time we will pay for your education. If you quit, you're on your own. I should have guessed that was coming, and they were absolutely correct in their assessment. My parents had seen nothing but my happiness during the time at Tanrakin Farm, but they knew it was a dead-end street with no advancement potential. They believed in me and knew I was better than a manure shoveler. My past failures academically and socially still haunted me. There was nothing to run from, yet I strongly felt the need to run away. Why not California? It appeared risk-free. Maybe, I thought, distance would ensure my success. In May 1975, I packed my 1974 Dodge van for a month-long journey out west. I built into the back of the van a bed that could fold up on the side. I also made a set of music speakers with woofers and tweeters and a crossover network that stood about 3 feet tall and weighed 30 pounds each. I secured a Coleman icebox and stove into practical positions and filled in spaces with boxes of things such as clothes and food. My bright yellow Canary Cottage, as my grandfather called it, was ready for the drive across America. 6 months earlier, I had found a German Shepherd mix at the Millwood, New York SPCA. He was given a clean bill of health in the free vets exam that came with adoption that day, and I decided to call him E-Z, Easy. A short 24 hours later, I returned to the same vet with my new friend, now with projectile diarrhea. I was angry that he was so sick after receiving an exam recently. Even though the vet did nothing egregious, I was left with a feeling that I had been dismissed because Easy was just a pound dog and I was not wealthy. Nobody likes to be treated this way, and it became another lesson I would never forget in how to deal with animal owners with respect and dignity. I took Easy home and cared for him as if I would die if he did. I know he sensed my love, and even though he had been given up by someone as a puppy, and he had no reason to trust another human, he seemed to forgive me and my species, rested himself in my arms, and as we slept together that night, began the healing process that cured his diarrhea and bonded us for life. Easy followed me everywhere on the farm, but his greatest love was to plop himself into the passenger seat of my van and either look out the window while I drove or sleep in the sun. It was before sunrise when Easy and I headed for my tightly packed van on our way to a new adventure in California. I drove the van out of the pony barn driveway and away from my first home and away from my parents. Easy went to sleep in the seat. Prue, a friend of mine in New York, had given me 2 books before the westward trip. The first was Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. The story was about one man's travel across the country with his dog, Charlie, and the adventures they had. The second was a journal of blank pages where I could write my thoughts. My first 2 weeks were boring. I made several stops on my way to the Mississippi River where I said hello to different people, but every stop seemed disappointing. Maybe I was looking for a friend who could say, "Geoff, this looks like fun. Can I join you?" It didn't happen. Slowly, I realized I had no friends, at least no one who was looking to do something different in their lives. Easy was a great friend, but not a great conversationalist. Once I reached California, my first order of business was to find a place to stay. I was not looking to rent in town, so I traveled the area where there were horse farms. I entered an area called Hope Ranch, which was a community of exclusive homes, many with horse farms. I found a beautiful place overlooking the Pacific Ocean and drove in. Just like I had done 2 years before, I had no plan, but I had an expectation of a positive result. Was I scared? Yes, but I also knew what I wanted. I found a farm and a girl named Kathy who stabled her horse Timberline there. She lived in one half of the duplex in return for taking care of the horses for the owner. I told her I was looking for a place to live in return for working on the farm, and somehow, by the end of the day, I was moving into the other half of the duplex. Kathy was beautiful, and I was falling in love immediately. Having plenty of experience in the stupid department, I tried not to show it and kept my thoughts to myself. It was easy because Kathy showed no interest in me other than being friends. The farm was beautiful, too. It was created and built by the architect owner who lived there with his wife and gorgeous daughter. The house was a beautiful California style and looked nothing like what I was used to on the East Coast. The views of the ocean with the Catalina Islands in the distance were spectacular. The house sat on top of a cliff. Paddocks and an outdoor arena lay between it and the six-stall barn, the duplex, and another guest house that was empty. I soon came to the conclusion that everything and everyone in California was beautiful. It was without exception. My classes in photography started at 8 a.m. sharp. I soon was becoming proficient in the darkroom, where there were at least 20 stations. I bought a 4x5-inch view camera and tripod. This type of camera was used 100 years ago, and I'm sure you've seen them in old movies. The photographer, with his head under a light-proof cloth, would tell everyone to hold still, and then an explosion of light would ignite the material on the flash pan, and a puff of smoke would envelop the area. While our flashes were now electronic, the principles of tilting the lens and the film plane to compensate for distortion were the same. Each shot was meticulously planned, lighting was metered, and the picture content was framed. One shot was taken, then the film removed from the camera and replaced with another piece of film measuring 4x5 inches, and another shot was set up. It was a very long process. We also studied studio lighting, the positioning of models, chemistry, and legal matters involving the capturing of people's images used for commercial purposes. There were tons of great stuff to learn, but I quickly became uninterested. Again, the horses and I would find each other. Kathy's dad was a high-ranking polo player in Santa Barbara, and I soon was visiting the polo fields in Carpinteria, about 30 minutes southeast of Hope Ranch. Kathy and I attended the games, and I would start to pitch in cleaning tack, cleaning stalls, and rolling the countless leg and tail wraps after they were washed. I learned the ins and outs of polo and soon found myself grooming for the games. I was even allowed to wrap their tails before the game, knowing that if I did a poor job and it fell off, I would owe a case of beer to someone. I offered to exercise the polo ponies in the morning because the players couldn't consistently do this during the week. They readily agreed. This is a good point to say that I had never really ridden a horse before. Starting Monday, I was going to exercise 15 to 18 horses by riding one and ponying 2 others alongside. If this sounds simple to you, realize that not all of these polo ponies were calm trail horses. They were just the opposite, with high temperaments and minds of their own on what they were or were not going to do. So it took me much longer than it might have an experienced rider to get everyone exercised. I woke up in the very early hours of the morning and in the dark found Oaxa, a horse that I fed and cared for on the property in exchange for color television for my apartment. Once he was fed, I then drove 30 minutes to the polo field and again, in the dark, tacked up one horse, gathered 2 horses, and headed to the dirt oval track. I would do a turn at the walk, then trot, then gallop enough to make them breathe a little hard. I would return to the stables, untack, brush off all evidence of tack from their hair coats, and repeat the process until the 5 or 6 sets were back in their stalls eating their morning feed. While this doesn't really sound like much to a horse person, you need to realize that I did this all before my 8 a.m. classes. I loved it, and I was obsessed about being with horses. The Santa Ynez Valley is on the other side of the mountains from Santa Barbara. Getting to it requires a drive through a pass that, when on the other side, takes your breath away. The yellow and pale green rolling hills are dotted with large bushy trees that appear to float over the ground. Many horse farms are located here, and on occasion, Kathy and I would travel there to witness a hunt where horses would chase the scent of a fox. One of the obstacles the horses would be required to jump was a chicken coop filled with live chickens. That one was fun to watch and photograph, as a potential for disaster was ever present. I love Santa Barbara. The easygoing way Californians lived was a sharp contrast to the high energy of New Yorkers. The weather was always perfect. There were miles of beaches. The land was beautiful, and there were plenty of horses. I was not homesick, and there was absolutely nothing I could think of that would make me want to go back east. One day, a family moved into the empty guest house, and it was apparent the man was an equine veterinarian. His name was Dr. Mansman, and he was starting his practice in the area. How perfect was this, I thought. Here's someone who could really teach me something about caring for these beautiful animals. I soon made room on my plate to include any time I could with this man. My first steps toward becoming a veterinarian were the encouraging words by him and other veterinarians as they answered my questions. The first equine veterinarian to encourage me was Dr. Woodcock at Tanracken Farm back in New York. He was retired then and came to the farm to do the herd health and the newborn exams. With his experience and seniority, he taught me to not take life seriously and to joke a lot. Dr. Steiner became Dr. Woodcock's replacement on the farm, and while he also had energy and a great work ethic, his influence on me wasn't appreciated until much later. It was therefore Dr. Mansman who truly became my first mentor in equine veterinary practice. Today, most practitioners have help in the truck, but back then, Dr. Mansman worked alone. His wife kept the books and did the office duties, as my wife did years later when I started my practice. Any chance I could get to ride on calls with him, I took, but I didn't have the passion for veterinary medicine yet. My agenda was just to learn more about horses at this point, not to become a veterinarian. The idea of me ever going back to a real college was off my radar screen. One day I found Dr. Mansman in the wash stall of the barn with a horse in cross ties. The horse was very sleepy looking, and the cross ties were fighting to maintain their integrity as they equally held the weight of the heavily sedated horse. The vet was a very quiet man and methodically moved with deliberate measure. I asked what he was doing, and it took a moment before he responded. "I'm castrating this horse." He didn't say no when I asked if I could watch, so I kept my distance while he worked. In little time, the job was completed, and I thanked him and left. I had seen castrations before, and they were usually done in a dark and dirty stall with one man holding the horse with a lead rope and a twitch twisted tightly on his nose. The horse was sedated, but not enough for cutting off his testicles, so the twitch was necessary to keep him still. Nonetheless, the colt would usually try to take a few side swipes with his hind foot at the vet. Here, though, Dr. Mansman worked in a clean and well-lit environment, and he worked alone. Also unique was his use of a human leg crutch placed under the horse's chin to support the head while the operation was performed. It looked clever to me, as this one-man show did what other vets needed 2 or 3 people to do. On another day, I was hanging out with Dr. Mansman as he stocked his truck. His wife came out to tell him there was a colic case that needed his attention. I was about to ask where his stock of firecrackers were, but I decided not to ask. I just got into his truck and rode along. I had only been with horses for a few years, but I had seen several colics. All had been medical and were treated with all sorts of concoctions, including just walking it off. Today, as we pulled into the farm located behind the house, he muttered, "Oh no, this doesn't look good." This horse was very uncomfortable. Dr. Mansman took out his stethoscope and performed his exam. He passed his stomach tube, administered medications, and talked with the owners. What impressed me, and has stayed with me, was how he treated these people. He was straightforward and polite, but also compassionate. He took his time explaining to the owners what was going on. At this point, I didn't understand exactly what was wrong, but I knew this was a colic that concerned him. I've modeled my approach to clients in my own practice based on this one event. We climbed back into his pickup, and as we were just rolling out of the driveway, Dr. Mansman turned directly to me and soberly remarked, "That horse isn't going to make it." We drove home, and I don't know what we talked about. All I knew was it was the first horse I knew that was soon going to be dead, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Numbness entered my mind. I didn't realize it then, but it was my first experience of self-preservation. My mind takes bad experiences with horses and dumps that memory by the time I reach the end of the barn driveway. In my years as a veterinarian, I quickly realized that if I internalized the pain and suffering horses went through, I would be committed to a psychiatric facility in short order. Looking back, I clearly see this day with Dr. Mansman as my first detachment of the outcome, because to do otherwise would have turned me into an ineffective veterinarian. Dr. Mansman went on to develop a large and successful equine practice and then became a professor at a prominent veterinary college. I've seen him at a few meetings where he lectures on very practical things. I've twice thanked him for his mentorship, but I don't think he really remembers me. The short time I had with him helped form me and my style of veterinary care, though at the time I didn't realize it. My stay in California was soon drawing to an end. With all that I loved about it, I needed to leave. Photography was fun, but was quickly becoming a chore. Working as a photographer did not inspire me and was certainly not something I was passionate about. I spent every free moment from 3 in the morning until I went to bed with horses. I had bought the book Lameness in Horses by O.R. Adams. This was the Bible every vet used to learn detection and causes as well as treatment for horse lameness. I couldn't pronounce most of the words, but still I would fall asleep reading it. I memorized the drawings and pictures. I was becoming exhausted as I worried about what my parents would say when I told them I was quitting college yet again. I couldn't help but feeling like a big failure, and my self-esteem was tanking. 3 strikes at an education, and God only knows how many strikes with girls that went nowhere. I needed some alone time, so I walked from the farm to the empty lot next door and sat down on a stump in the woods. My mind drifted, and I allowed it to. Often clarity comes from letting go. Easy ran away from me and down the path that led to the clothing optional beach below. He was a regular, and I had plenty of time for him to make the rounds and greet whoever was there. I never fell asleep, but I have no recollection of anything between the time Easy left and his triumphant return. His tongue hung out as far as possible, dripping gooey saliva over my lap as he nudged me back into reality. Panting heavily, his clear brown eyes penetrated mine, as if to say, "Hey, I'm back. Are you all right? Want to throw that stick for me?" In my hand was a long, thin stick. It was not the type I would select to throw for a dog, and I really don't remember getting the stick. I looked around wondering why I had it. When I looked down, I saw a patch of sand at my feet and a drawing of a horse's head I had made with a stick. I have no recollection of doing it, but apparently my subconscious knew more about what I wanted than my conscious mind did at that point. I smiled from ear to ear, and I shouted, "Come on, Easy, we're going back to New York." Story time. If you don't pull out my heifer calf alive, I'm gonna kill you. It was a warm summer's day, and the grass and trees were green. There was little humidity, and the temperature hung in the upper 70s with a light breeze. I was on my rounds of the farms my boss had set on the list. Hen scratch on a torn piece of yellow lined paper with his faint words echoing directions in my head. Go into town, go left on the Mariposa Road, then right on the grist mill lane, and so forth. He always added the word "the" in front of the name of the road. I was about an hour late getting to this farm where a cow had been having difficulty delivering her calf. I was fresh out of vet school and looked forward to my life with horses. But until I was earning enough to pay the bills in my own practice, I had joined a nearby general country practice. We treated cows, dogs, and cats, as well as pigs, sheep, goats, rabbits, and yes, a horse or two. I would work all day, then drive 44 miles home, change into clothes void of the barn smells. I then went off on my own horse calls until late at night. It was on this brilliant summer day in upstate New York where I learned about confidence. I had tied the tail back, cleaned up the cow's perineum, and with my arm lubricated, I entered her birth canal. My hand and arm gently twisted, and my fingertips ended against a wall of twisted uterine tissue. I pulled out and stood up and faced the cow's owner. He was a no-nonsense, scruffy-looking professional herdsman. He showed contempt as he stared at this new, wet-behind-the-ears veterinary graduate. "What about her?" he said with point-blank expectation. I was excited because I knew exactly what the problem was and how to deal with it, though it was my first. "Your cow has a uterine torsion," I exclaimed with pride. His face screwed up as he shot. "What? Say it in English." "The calf has twisted the uterus along the birth canal. The opening is closed and there's no way the calf can get out," I flatly explained. "All right. What can you do for her?" he said quickly, getting to the meat of the situation. "Oh, it's simple. We'll do a plank in the flank." My confidence was based on the very clear discussion of this approach I had recently learned in my lectures at Cornell. Though I had never done one, it made sense to me. My professor, though, never told me what to expect next. "You're going to do what? What the heck? Where's your boss? Plank in the flank? Who's ever come up with that?" His rants would have gone on, but I felt more confidence welling up in my gut. I told his assistants, who had been watching silently nearby, to find a 16-foot, 2 by 6 inch wood plank and take it along with the cow up to the grandmother's house, where there was a large grass lawn. Apparently, my barking of specific orders instilled some confidence, at least in the help. We assembled ourselves on the flat grass operating field. I placed my rope around the cow's neck and passed the end through the metal quick-release loop on its end. Positioning the loop where the withers would be on a horse, I took the rope rearward along the cow's backbone just a few inches, then turned the rope at right angles away from me and down along the cow's right side. Recovering the end of the rope underneath the cow, I brought the end up her left side and slid it underneath the rope at her backbone, effectively forming a loop of rope around her at the girth area. I repeated this forming of a loop around the cow's body just in front of her hip bones. The remaining rope I proceeded to extend rearwards about 3 feet behind her. With someone standing in front of her and holding her by the halter, I proceeded to pull my end of the rope behind her as hard as I could. My pulling caused the 2 loops of rope around her body to compress her sides. This cow, like dozens of others before her, just dropped without objection to the ground and then fell to her side. It wasn't just any side, but the correct side, because I had guided her. This part had been important because my next step was to place the end of the 16-foot board on top of her abdomen just in front of her hips. I would stand on the end of the board that was resting on her abdomen. My weight would apply downward pressure, trapping the calf in the uterus. The 2 men would then roll the cow over to her other side while I kept the calf inside the uterus in place, effectively untwisting the uterus. However, if she was placed on the wrong side, then all we would do is twist everything tighter. I conducted all to their positions while I mounted the board. Another thing my professor had forgotten to tell us was how hard it was to balance on top of this mass. Beach Boys songs about surfing leapt into my mind. While I struggled to balance, I ordered the men to roll the cow. Slowly, the process commenced. I danced and regained my balance. The cow groaned but did not struggle. Completed, I jumped off my perch and positioned myself behind the lying cow. As I inserted my hand, the owner came up behind me and calmly but clearly said, "If you don't pull out my heifer calf alive, I'm going to kill you." My fingers at this point touched the calf's nose through a now open birth canal, and the calf, very much alive, bumped me back. I turned my head and looked at him and said with a cocky attitude, "What if I pull out a live bull calf?" Without a blink of an eye, he said, "Then I'll just maim you." By now, I had my hands around the calf's legs and was pulling out the bundle of life. I had no worries about him maiming me, and my cockiness got the better of me. So I said, "What do I get when I pull out a live heifer?" He paused, then said, "I'll buy you a case of beer." I made my last effort to pull the large heifer out, and she breathed her first breath. "Make it 2 cases," I said. I never got a drop of beer from this farmer that summer afternoon. I gained from him, though, an understanding of human behavior and a feeling that I had chosen the right profession. Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.